Well, good morning, everyone. I would invite you to take your Bibles and open me to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 this morning. We're going to look at verses 1 through 8. And as you make your way to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, I want to talk about what's happening in the progress from chapter 1 to chapter 2. You might recall that in chapter 1, the Apostle Paul said this to the Thessalonian believers, "You know what kind of men we proved to be among you." And then he commended them, saying this, "And you became imitators of us." As we step into chapter 2, he's going to remind them exactly what kind of men they actually were among them so that they could be like Paul and Silas and Timothy, and by extension, so that we can be like them as well amongst the people that God has placed around us. And in the process of describing themselves, he's going to give us two lists of godly and ungodly characteristics and motivations for spiritual leadership. And it speaks to what we all know to be true, and that's the fact that there are good leaders and there are bad leaders. There are leaders that we would gladly follow, and there are leaders that, if we're honest about it, we really hate that we have to follow them. I'm going to illustrate that this way. When I was in the Army and stationed in Germany, my unit in Germany was shipped to Saudi Arabia and then into Iraq for the Gulf War. And my section sergeant at that point was a man named Sergeant McCrae. This is Sergeant McCrae down here in the lower corner of this picture. And Sergeant McCrae was a great guy. He was really a strong leader. And in the course of the number of years that I got to spend under his leadership, he really became a good friend to me. And at one point when we were in Iraq, he came to me and he said, "I've been ordered to go on a mission outside the wire, and it's just going to be me and whoever it is that goes with me. And there's certainly potential danger anytime you go outside of the safety of your own compound and go into hostile territory, that any number of things could take place." And he said this to me. He says, "I'm not going to order you to go with me, but I'm going to ask you to go with me." And I just look back and think, that's such a great guy way to motivate someone to do something that's potentially dangerous, not to put it forward like, "You've got to do this thing because I'm telling you to," but he's appealing to me based on our relationship, based upon what he knows about me from my reputation, and what he's been able to discern about me based on my character. And he said, "Of all the people that I could choose to go on this mission with, I'm asking if you would be the one to accompany me." And based on everything I knew about him and his reputation and his character and the demonstrated leadership that he's shown over many other circumstances and experiences that we shared together, I said to him without hesitation, "Wherever you lead, I'm going to follow." Now, I'm going to contrast that with a second lieutenant who's going to remain both nameless and faceless because he's not here to defend himself and, well, the internet. I'm not going to name him, but he was an individual that I really hated the fact that I had to follow him. He was, again, a second lieutenant, so he was very new as an officer. He was a West Point graduate, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he was capable or qualified for the position of leadership that he had. And one day he asked me to go on a mission with him, and he's holding the map upside down as he's trying to plot directions. And I just looked at him and I said, "Sir." You know, not that kind of necessarily respectful or admirable, "Yes, sir," but it was more like, "Sir." And then there was another time where we were on a different mission together, and he needed directions because, again, he was not necessarily handling the map all that well. And we saw a group of people gather together. He said, "We'll drive towards them." They're American soldiers. As we drive toward them, they turned the Humvee-mounted 50 caliber machine guns that they had on us. And we find out that they were a group of Rangers, and they were processing Iraqi prisoners. And I don't know if you know anything about the Madus or the 50 cal machine gun, but that bullet travels at such velocity it doesn't even have to hit you to tear limbs off your body. And he says, I said, "Sir, I don't think we should go up to them." He said, "Oh, it's going to be fine." Again, I look at him and I just said, "Sir," as I took a hard left. And there was another time where we had a Scud alert, so a Scud missile was launched by Iraq into Saudi Arabia or Israel or wherever it was going, and we had the alert to get to our bunkers that we had built within our base. And so all of us are in the bunker, and we're doing what people do when they're in the bunker, is potentially deadly missiles fly over your head. We're telling jokes and that sort of thing. And all of a sudden he pulls open the canvas door to our bunker, and he leans in and he says, "What are you guys doing in here?" And in unison, like one heavenly choir, we all together looked at him and we said, "Sir." He just didn't know what was happening most of the time. And in the Army, we had a term for that. It was called being ate up. And he was ate up. And it just speaks to the fact that he was inept as a leader, really unqualified as a leader. And so the reality is this: there are good leaders, there are bad leaders. There are capable leaders, there are inept leaders. There are moral and selfless leaders, and there are immoral and selfish leaders. And I know that as we work through this material this morning, you're going to look at me as the lead pastor of the church, and you're going to be evaluating me for what kind of leader I am. And I'll just say this at the outset: you ought to do that. You ought to be examining me against this text to determine what kind of leader I am. You may be considering other people in your life who have influence and what kind of leadership they have. But I will say this before we get into the text. If God has given you any measure of influence in the life of another person or another group of people, you are then a leader. And so I would encourage you to evaluate yourself as well as we walk through these characteristics and these motives to determine what kind of leader are you and how are you using the influence that God has entrusted to you. And last week we talked about the fact that reputation matters, but today this is not a matter of your reputation. This is a matter of your character and the inward motivations of your heart that cause you to do all that you do that only you and God may really know about. So with that said, notice with me 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Paul says this: "For you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain, but though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict." So Paul is revealing to us the first two characteristics of a godly leader. The first is a willingness to suffer for the sake of the gospel. And the second is a boldness to declare truth in the face of that suffering. Too many leaders in the Christian faith expect their followers to bear all the burdens and to shoulder all the sacrifices and pain while they live at least one step removed from all of that sacrifice and all that pain and all that burden bearing. I don't know if you remember this or follow these things in the wider Christian community, but a number of years ago there was a pastor, and I'm saying this not by way of gossip, this was very well known, but there was a pastor named Creflo Dollar who asked his congregation to pony up $65 million to buy him a Gulfstream G65 jet for the sake of the gospel so he could travel around the world sharing Jesus with other people. And the reality was he was worth $27 million as he made that request. He's asking other people to shoulder the burden of $65 million to buy him a private plane while he himself is already worth $27 million. Now, I would just say to you this morning, there's far too much of that in corporate Christianity today where people are doing what Paul said he would never do, and that is peddle the gospel for personal gain. Paul actually says to the Thessalonians, "You know how we were treated in Philippi." These events are described for us in the book of Acts, and there we see Paul arriving in the city of Philippi, the first city he visited as he entered into Macedonia, and there was no synagogue for him to visit, meaning there weren't at least 10 Jewish men present there to start a synagogue, and so he went to where people were gathered down by the river's edge, and there he met a woman named Lydia, who he led to Jesus Christ, and then she became the hostess to that early church that met there under her hospitality. And we're told in Acts 16 that as Paul was ministering there in Philippi, there was a demon-possessed slave girl who would follow him around. This went on for many days, just declaring or crying out, "These men are the servants of the Most High God who proclaim to you the way of salvation." Now the reality is that's an absolutely true statement. But Luke tells us that Paul became annoyed by her constant recitation or repetition of this very true statement. And the reason why he became annoyed is everyone knew that this woman was connected to the demonic, and Paul did not want to seem like his ministry and his message was connected to anything idolatrous or demonic. And so in his annoyance with what this woman was doing under her demonic influence, commands this demon to come out of her, and in that very moment it did, and she lost her ability to tell people's fortunes, and that then resulted in her slave owners losing the income that came from her fortune telling and so on and so forth. So they dragged Paul and Silas into court, where we're told they were beaten with rods. Just imagine how painful that experience was. And after having been beaten with rods, they were thrown into prison and put in stocks. We described this experience in the first week of our journey through 1 Thessalonians. But Paul would have had his ankles chained nearly to his ankles as he was bent over in an extremely uncomfortable position, and then having to endure that for hour upon hour after already having been severely beaten with rods. And what does the Scripture find Paul and Silas doing in prison, in stocks, having been beaten with rods, still suffering extreme amounts of pain and discomfort? They're singing hymns and praises to God. And we're told the other prisoners heard them. And then God shook the earth in such a way that all of their chains fell off and the stocks sprung open, and so they had freedom at their fingertips. The Philippian jailer comes running in, fearing that all of the prisoners would have taken this opportunity to escape, and knowing that as the jailer, if a prisoner escaped under his watch, he would suffer the fate of those that ran free, that he lost under his care. So he was prepared to take his own life. And then Paul and Silas stop him from committing suicide, saying not just that he and Silas were there, but saying that we are all still here. That even these unbelieving prisoners, hearing Paul and Silas praising God, even in the stocks and having been beaten with rods, they didn't run when they had the chance. The power of a testimony for Jesus Christ, even among unbelievers, to change people's natural inclinations. The Philippian jailer takes Paul and Silas back to his home, binds up their wounds, and in the process they put their faith collectively as a family in Jesus Christ. And they become part of this fledgling church there in the city of Philippi. But Paul is reminding them that they endured such affliction and suffering in bringing the gospel to them in Thessalonica. And I want you to notice in part how Paul suffered for the sake of the gospel. And one of the most honest texts that we get from the Apostle Paul concerning the hardships that he faced in his apostolic ministry. Notice 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Chapter 1, chapter 4, chapter 11, chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, Paul sort of gives us an insider view of all the things that he suffered for the sake of the gospel. And here he says, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less 1, 39 lashes with the whip. And the reason why it was always 39 minus 1 is that minus 1 was considered mercy. That 40 could actually kill a man. And so it wasn't just once that Paul had to endure this. It wasn't twice or 3 times, but he says 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes less one. You can imagine when the great apostle Paul would have taken off his cloak, what his back must have looked like, and just the scar trails that would run across his skin. 3 times I was beaten with rods, including in the city of Philippi. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, in danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, and often without food, in cold and exposure. And then on top of all of these things, in the next verse, the Apostle Paul talks about the greatest care that weighed upon his soul was his care and concern for the churches that he had planted. Paul enduring all of these things for the sake of the gospel. And the result of this is that you could not intimidate this man. You couldn't shut him up. When you look at the Apostle Paul's life, he declared the gospel of Jesus Christ to kings and peasants, Jews and Gentiles, the rich and the powerful, the poor and the powerless. He declared the gospel to soldiers and business owners and slave owners and slaves, and he was willing to suffer for the sake of the gospel, so that he could say to any that followed him, I would never lead you where I refuse to go. I would never ask you to embrace what I refuse to embrace. I would never call you to sacrifice what I refuse to sacrifice. That's a true leader. That's a gospel leader. That's a godly leader. Now notice as we look at verses 3 through 6, the passage goes from the positive to negative characteristics and motivations for leadership. Notice what he writes. For our appeal does not spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please man, but to please God who tests our hearts. For we never came with words of flattery, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed. God is our witness. Nor did we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ, but we were gentle among you. And we're going to consider that here as we move forward. In this portion of the text, we get one positive trait, but then we get all 7 of the negative traits that Paul lists out for us, almost as if these are the antithesis or the exact opposite of how Paul and his team conducted themselves when they were among the Thessalonians. And so what he's saying is, we didn't do any of these negative things, but the implication is there were some leaders and even spiritual leaders out there who did. Paul speaks to this fact in Philippians chapter 1 when he acknowledges that there were some preaching Christ from selfish ambitions. Notice what these things are. He said there are some out there whose teaching springs from error. This is the danger of cherry-picking verses to make the argument that the preacher just wants to make. This is the error of ignoring the historical and the grammatical context of the text. This is the error of reading modern meanings into ancient text. That's called eisegesis rather than exegesis. And it is common today in the error found in the church, where people read modern thoughts, modern thinking, modern definitions into these ancient texts. Rather, our job as good Bible students is to exegete, that is, to pull meaning out of the text, not to put meaning into the text. Then he says there are some whose teaching springs from impurity. This word impurity speaks of sexual immorality, sexual license. I'm going to ask you to hang on to that for a moment. He says there are some who inherently seek to deceive people. This means these folks aren't just making an honest mistake, they're intentionally and willfully lying to people, and they know it. He says there are some leaders who are seeking to please people rather than pleasing God. Now, I would submit to you this morning that that's the greatest leadership trap that there is. The Scriptures refer to this category of sin as fear of man. And it condemns the fear of man, because what it does is it actually enslaves the person to the opinions and desires of others. And so you might have a position of influence, and through that position of influence, you are a leader. But if you walk in the fear of man, where you base your identity or your worth or your value or your meaning and place in life based on the opinions and desires and applause of other people, you may have the title, you may sit in the seat, you may have the position, but they're leading, not you. Because you are beholden to them, because they have something that you believe in your mind you need from them. So you are not leading them, they are leading you. And then he says, some use flattery to manipulate people. God actually forbids flattery in the Scripture. One example of that would be Proverbs 24:5, where it says, a man who flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. God knows that flattery is a trap. It's a smokescreen for other desires and ambitions. So they're talking someone up for the purpose of manipulating them in order to get what they want from them. So flattering speech is a tool of manipulation to try to control people. And then he says there are some who are hiding greedy motives. The word that Paul uses here, pretext, pictures intentionally hiding something under a cloak or behind a false pretense. Peter speaks of this in 2 Peter chapter 2, where he talks about these false teachers who seem like very spiritual people, but they come into local congregations and they make merchandise out of the believers. Literally, their intention is to appear pious, to appear holy, to appear to be people of good intention, but they literally want to buy and sell people for their own gain. And listen, loved ones, if that was happening in the church 2,000 years ago, it's still happening in the church today. And then he says, there are some who use their position to seek glory from other people. That word glory has the idea of brightness or praise or greatness. These are the leaders who want to lead because they crave the pat on the back. They crave the title. They crave the position. They don't care about serving other people. They don't care about helping other people. They're using people to get from them what they want. And I'll say this, everyone loves a compliment. Everyone loves to hear thank you for something that they would do for another person, but the danger comes when you need that compliment in order to feel good about yourself or your ministry. Jesus actually says that if your motivation for doing whatever it is that you're doing is to receive praise from man, you should not expect to get any praise from God. You've already gotten your reward. Matthew 6:5-6, John 5:41, John 12:43. Warning upon warning upon warning that if you're living for the pat on the back, once you get that, don't expect any praise or reward from God for that thing that you just did. So, what's the takeaway here? I think for us in this text that these inherently selfish traits, they do exist in some leaders and even some pastors today. And the problem that no one really wants to talk about is these sinful and ungodly characteristics can actually be very effective at building a crowd. Think with me. You can gather a really big group of people if you're willing to tell them what they already want to hear. That's why a gospel that never touches a person's sexuality is really appealing to some people. A gospel that purports that you can accept Jesus and still identify however you want and still sleep with whoever you want, that's really appealing to some people today. And it's the heartbeat behind progressive and affirming Christianity. But I would contend to you, loved ones, progressive Christianity that cherry picks passages out of the New Testament, especially out of the Gospels, to paint a portrait of Jesus that is not biblical. Progressive Christianity is not biblical Christianity. It's not Christianity. I would also say that's why the prosperity gospel is the fastest growing strain of Christianity globally. Why? Because you're telling people what they already want to hear. Everyone already wants to be healthy, wealthy, and happy. And if you promise people that Jesus gives them that, they're going to be inclined to believe, especially desperate people that are in poverty and lack and so forth. The problem is the Bible doesn't promise health, wealth, and prosperity in this life. I would contend it's an over-realized eschatology that seeks to pull heaven into earth. But listen, heaven is perfect. This earth is not. Heaven is marked by the no mores. No more pain, no more suffering, no more tears, no more death, no more sorrow. But this world is broken. In heaven, we won't need endurance. In heaven, we won't need to suffer well. But in this life, endurance is essential. You can't live it without endurance. You can't honor God in this broken world without a willingness to endure. The prosperity gospel certainly wasn't Paul's gospel. In fact, just in 1 Thessalonians, he says that you know that we came to you and preached the gospel in the midst of persecution, and you received the gospel in the midst of much persecution and affliction. Paul didn't promise that if you accept Jesus, all your problems are going to be over. In fact, he promised that if you accept Jesus, you're going to get a whole new set of problems, but Jesus is with you in them. And there's purpose to that pain that you're going to endure for the sake of Christ. And that as you endure for the sake of Christ, that's going to be a powerful apologetic and witness to a watching world. And when this life is over, you're going to get to go to heaven and be with God face to face. And there'll be no pain. There'll be no suffering. But not in this life. And Paul says, because of all of that, they were approved by God who tests the heart. That's actually the same Greek word used 2 different times, approved and test. It means to hold up to the light in order to examine or test the genuineness of a thing. So Paul says the fact that we were willing to preach the gospel in much affliction proves the reality of saving faith within us, that we are able to steward the gospel that had been invested in us. I want you to notice what Peter says here concerning this in 1 Peter 1, verses 6 and 7. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, and it is, you have been grieved by various trials. Why, Peter? Why have we been grieved by various trials? So that the tested genuineness of your faith, the reality of saving faith at work in you, that is more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in the praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Peter, Paul, John, James, Jude, Jesus, any of these New Testament writers, they never promise that if you accept Jesus by faith, that all of your problems are over. What they do say is that your willingness to endure suffering is a reflection and evidence of saving faith within you. So suffering is often that test that we have to take to reveal the genuineness of the faith that is in us. So listen, one day this renewed universe is going to be our playground. One day, heaven is going to be our home. And more importantly than any of that, one day we're going to stand before the unveiled, consuming and penetrating glory of God. And rather than be consumed by that, we're going to be fulfilled by that. We're going to be satisfied by that. We're going to glory in that. We're going to rejoice in that. Pain will be no more. Death will be no more. But today isn't that day. Today we're called to take up our cross. Today we're called to die to ourselves. Today we're called to take our stand. Today we're called to strive. Today we're called to wrestle. Today we're called to put on our armor and to fight. When I was going through training in the Army, you go through basic training, then you go through advanced individual training, or AIT. And in AIT, we had a drill sergeant who, whenever you didn't follow his directions perfectly, he would tell you to do one of 2 things. The first thing he might say to you if you disappointed him or didn't follow his directions, he'd say, choke yourself. And the first time he'd tell someone to choke themselves, they would sheepishly and kind of hesitantly, put their hands around their throat and begin to choke themselves. And that's not what he wanted you to do. What he would do do is he would hold his hand out about this high. He would literally want you to get on your knees and put your neck in his hand so that he could squeeze you enough to remind you that you didn't do what he wanted you to do. The second thing that he might ask you to do is to beat your face. And to beat your face means to do push-ups, but to make sure with every downstroke of the push-up, you hit your nose on the floor. He was what I would call stern. He was stern. But listen, his job was not to make us happy. His job was not to tell us what we wanted to hear. His job was not to make us comfortable. His job was not to make us feel good about ourselves. His job was to get us ready to go to war and survive war. And in this life, pain and temptation is going to find you. It's just going to find you. And a pastor's job isn't to tell you what you already want to hear. It's to get you ready for when that pain finds you, when that temptation finds you. You'll be able to take your stand and endure it and come out the other side victorious, having glorified God in the midst of it. Now, notice how the text ends, verses 7 and 8. He says, "But we were gentle among you like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. Having so been affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us." I just love these two verses and that Paul puts them where he does. What he says is that a godly leader doesn't just share the message of the gospel with the people that he leads. He doesn't just manage the people that he leads, but he loves them. And in loving them, he not only imparts the gospel to them, but he imparts his very life to the people that he leads. Paul says that he could have come making demands of them because of his apostolic office. But rather, he says, he came and he was gentle among them. You may have a translation that says that they were like children among them, or they were like infants among them. When you look at this Greek word through the rest of the New Testament, it's translated as infant or child or children. It has the idea of being kind. It has the idea of being humble. It has the idea of being unpresuming, or rather than demanding among them. That you knew that you didn't come saying what people had to do for you, but you came serving. And he illustrates their conduct among the Thessalonian believers with one of the tenderest and most beautiful pictures I think that God has ever given us of love, service, and selfless sacrifice. And that's that picture of a mother nursing her newborn baby. Paul says that they shared their very lives with the Thessalonian believers. And isn't that the picture of that nursing mother caring for her child? Literally sharing her very life with that child. It's amazing to think about what happens there in that act. Is the mother, in many ways, is emptying herself out as the child is filled up. And then that mother, over the course of years, does that again and again and again, pouring herself out so the child can be nourished and filled up. That's what a leader ought to do. Maybe at this point you're thinking about your own mother. Or maybe you're a husband and you're thinking about your wife. I am so thankful that one of the highest compliments that I can sincerely say about my own wife is that she's a mom. She's not just a mother, she's a mom, and she's a wonderful nana, a wonderful grandmother who without complaint pours herself out on behalf of her children and her grandchildren. You might be a mom and you're reflecting back on your own time with your own children. I would say this about my mom. She's been with the Lord for a number of years now, and I do miss her terribly. I would say this about her. My mom was as gentle among us as we allowed her to be. I had two sisters, and they were unruly and hard to control, but at least she had me, and I was easy. That's not true. I was, without exaggeration, the worst of the three of us. But this week I got thinking about an event that took place when I was a teenager. My dad had already left, and my mom was sincerely trying the best that she could do as a single mom to raise 3 kids on her own who were not making that job easy on her. And at that time we had one of these old Atari game consoles. This is where you would stick the cartridge in the top of the game console. And one of the games that my older sister and I loved to play was called River Raider. And it was kind of this straight line game where you flew a plane down this canal, this river, and you had to shoot enemy things, planes and obstacles and whatever have you. And bear in mind, this is before the day when you could save progress on your game. So you were committed to that moment to go as far as you could. Well, I had high score in our family on the game River Raider. And one day I'm walking through the living room, and my older sister is playing, and she says to me, "I'm about to beat your score." So I stop what I'm doing. I sit down on the chair next to her. She's sitting on the floor with the game console on the floor in front of her looking at the TV, and she's just playing away, and I'm looking at her score. I'm looking at the high score, and I'm realizing I think she's about to beat my high score. And so, being the loving, thoughtful brother that I am, I reach down and turn the machine off. And she had been invested in this for quite some time. And so, without exaggeration, she freaked out. And if you've never had another human being leap upon you, she leapt upon me. And she began to pull my hair, and she began to punch me. And out of the corner of my eye, as she's doing this to me, I see my mom coming. And I'm thinking in my head, oh good, here comes Mom. She's going to pull her off of me. Which she does, but only so she could get her licks in. And so she starts hitting me and so on and so forth, after which she sent me to my room for the rest of the afternoon and so forth, and I learned not to turn the machine off on my sister ever again. Now, you may hear me share that story and think, what a terrible mother. I tell that story, and I think it's one of the most hilarious 3 minutes of my entire childhood, just because of the absurdity of all that took place. She was gentle. She was unpresuming. She rarely made demands upon us, but she was as gentle as we allowed her to be. But I will say this about my mother. I never for 1 second doubted that she was affectionately desirous of me. That's the phrase that Paul uses. That Greek word is used only here in the entire New Testament. And John MacArthur provided the best definition of what is being communicated here. So I'm just going to use his definition. But he says, this word speaks to a sense of love and devotion that runs so deep as to be unsurpassed. A sense of love and devotion that runs so deep as to be unsurpassed. That was my mom. She stood by my side through all of my mistakes. She stood by my side through all of my acts of disrespect and rebellion. She stood by my side when I was arrested as a teenager. She stood by my side when I came with Michelle to tell her that she was pregnant and we were not yet married and I was still in high school. She stood by my side when I was in Iraq. She stood by my side every day of her life. That was my mom. And that was the Apostle Paul. Sometimes when you read Paul's letters, you can think that Paul was kind of like that drill sergeant I described a few moments ago, that he was stern. And then you come to a passage like this and you realize that Paul sincerely and deeply loved the Lord. He sincerely and deeply loved the gospel, and he sincerely and deeply loved people as every spiritual leader ought to. So let me conclude with this. Just trying to serve you well and putting these characteristics into a chart so that you can see them. A godly leader looks like this. An ungodly leader looks like that. And I said at the beginning of the message that I know as we work through this text on what a godly leader looks like and what he doesn't look like, that at some level you're going to be evaluating me. And I would encourage you to do that. In the things that you know about me and the things that you've seen in me, do I fall on this side? Do I fall on this side? But understand that you're coming to your conclusion based on my reputation. You're going to come to your conclusion based on the things that I choose to show you. When I evaluate myself according to these lists, now I'm trying to come to my conclusion based on my character and who I really am inwardly in my heart. But I would encourage you once again that not only do you test me, not only do you test other leaders in your life, even spiritual leaders, but that you would examine yourself. And do you see these things present in your life? Do you see these things as driving motives in your life? Or do you see these things as being present in your life? This isn't about your reputation. This is about your character. And so, again, I'd ask you to consider, what kind of leader are you? Remember the context here. Paul says, you know what kind of men we proved to be among you for your sake. And you became imitators of us. So, who Paul proved to be is who he wanted the Thessalonians to become. And by extension to that, who Paul proved to be is who he wants us to be as Christ followers as well. It's not a question of qualification. It's not a question of reputation. It's a question of character. Do these things mark you as a Christ follower? The gospel transforms us and turns us from one thing into a brand new thing. So I'll ask it one final way before I pray. Does your character, your conduct, your motives, the way you love God and the way you love people reveal the reality of Christ in you? Whatever your answer may be, if it's not the way I want it to, then the gospel's the answer. And if your response is, praise God, yes, then the gospel is the reason. It always comes back to the reality of Christ in you.